newest publication that came out like a month ago in Science, and he'll tell us more about, I hope, the newest updates on carbon numbers in permafrost, which also includes the Tibetan Plateau. And so he will give a presentation, and then afterwards we will have time for questions regarding this presentation. And after that, we can spend some time talking about member updates, anything you would like to share in regard to new publications or meetings, or anything else that might be of interest to this group. I believe we can start with the presentation. Umakant, if you share your screen, that would be great. And welcome, everyone. I'm happy to see so many familiar names here. This is exciting.
And I just want to note that this presentation will be recorded. I forgot to mention that.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you, Miriam and Meredith. Okay, I hand it over to you, Umakant.
Thanks. I would like to stop my video and focus on the presentation, and I'll come back. Okay, so thank you very much, Christina, for your very nice and generous introduction. I'm Umakant Mishra, and I work as a soil scientist at Sandia National Lab, Livermore. And in this presentation, I'll be talking about the findings, major findings of our paper that was published in Science Advances about a month ago. And in this presentation, I'll be basically talking about the spatial heterogeneity that we quantified using our approach, and the environmental controllers of permafrost region soil carbon stocks. And we will, in this study, we have combined both Tibetan region with northern circumpolar region to make a new estimate of northern hemisphere permafrost region carbon stocks. So I would like to start with why we study soil carbon. Soils store the largest amount of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. And Professor Rattanlal's new number that was published in last year suggests that soils up to 2-meter depth store about 3,600 petagram carbon. And of this 3,600, about 2,000 is organic carbon, and about
sorry, I'm late here.
And 1,600 is soil inorganic carbon. So this magnitude of total carbon, including organic and inorganic carbon, is about 4 times the atmospheric carbon concentration and 6 times the carbon that currently global vegetation hold. Now, because of its large share, a small change in soil carbon pool can dramatically impact the atmospheric carbon concentration and the future carbon climate feedbacks that could result from this release. And this is why Earth system models are attempting to represent the soil carbon distributions appropriately, and also they are trying to represent the environmental controllers on soil organic carbon, which are used to predict the future carbon change in soils. It's not only climate change, we also need accurate spatial estimates of carbon stocks in order to understand what is the carbon sequestration potential of soils are. That means how much carbon from atmosphere the soils can absorb and store. And we also need spatial estimates to quantify the soil organic carbon change in order to develop carbon credit programs, where the land managers who sequester carbon are paid monetarily. And the figure is showing the global distribution of carbon stocks to 1 meter depth. And I took this figure to recognize the contribution of Neil Bartjes from International Soil Research Information Center, ISRIC, from Holland. He had spent his career in generating these global estimates of carbon and nitrogen and many other soil properties. Now let's move to permafrost soil organic carbon. The permafrost soil organic carbon is very important because on 16% of land area, these soils store about 36% of the global soil organic carbon. And we all know, being member of this IARPC, that under changing climate, permafrost systems represent sensitive component of the global carbon cycle. And we have very high uncertainties in permafrost carbon estimates, both in observational estimates and model representations. And to my knowledge, the reason we have highest uncertainty in observational estimates is because many of our regional studies depend on the secondary sources of information. That means we opportunistically use the soil organic carbon observations that may or may not be collected for the reason of producing soil carbon inventories. And if you see the figure on the top, you'll see that there is basically no agreement between what observation suggests the carbon distribution should be and what model represents. So the figure in this figure, the orange color is showing areas where models over predict carbon, and the blue color shows the areas where models under predict carbon. Similarly, there are uncertainties in prediction of carbon change from permafrost systems. A recent study by Tetsur et al. Showed that by 2100, there can be the release of carbon from in between 37 petagram to 174 petagram of carbon from northern circumpolar permafrost regions. So I would like to also show like why I think there are higher carbon storage in the permafrost systems, because these are unique features and unique component of a terrestrial carbon system. There are a great amount of loss deposition, which is wind-borne silt depositions rich in carbon concentration, and also because the large area is impacted by cryoturbation, that is freezing and thawing of soils due to seasonal changes in atmospheric temperature. And there is large area with peat soils, which has thick organic horizons, which store enormous amount of carbon stocks. And there is also a process called podgolization, which is the organo-mineral transport from upper horizon of soil to deeper horizon of soil, and which basically helps in a carbon sequestration process. Similarly, large area of permafrost systems is impacted by soil erosion and deposition process, and there are large deltaic areas where there is enormous amount of carbon stocks. Now I would like to come with two previous northern circumpolar studies which reported carbon stock distribution in the circumpolar permafrost region. The first study was conducted by Charles McCaa and colleagues, and this paper was published in 2009. And there they reported that permafrost region soils store about 1024 petagram of carbon in 0 to 3 meter depth interval. And they categorized their carbon distribution in basically three areas: low, medium, and high carbon concentration. And Gustav Hugelius and colleagues, who are also part of this PCN Permafrost Carbon Network, published updated study in 2014 in Biogeosciences, and they also use the same number of pedons, that is same number of samples, and represented a slightly higher carbon stock in 0 to 3 meter depth interval. But their major contribution was that they also quantified the uncertainties associated with their estimates. Both of these studies used an approach called thematic upscaling, where they upscaled the carbon stocks by using the soil order maps to generate the circumpolar permafrost region carbon stock estimates. Now, my objective in this study was to investigate the spatial and vertical heterogeneity of permafrost soil organic carbon stocks, both in Tibetan and permafrost regions. And we also attempted to identify locations where we have higher and lower uncertainties. And then we quantified what are the environmental controllers of these permafrost carbon stocks at different depth intervals and different study regions. And the approach that I have taken, it's called quantitative pedology, and this has been well documented in literature. I think a long time ago, V.V. Dokuchev from Russia stated that soil property at a location can be predicted as a function of biotic and abiotic factors. And then Hans Jenny from Berkeley wrote a book on factors of soil formation, where he said that soil properties at a location can be predicted as a function of climate, organism, relief, parent material, and time. And then in 2003, Alex McBratney from Australia said that if you take into account the spatial autocorrelation in the observations, you can optimize these predictions, or you can increase the prediction accuracy. And since then, this predictive framework has been used in hundreds of studies across the globe. And we have also used this study in the state of Alaska to predict the carbon stock of active layer component, permafrost component, and whole soil profile. And we published this study in 2012. Now, in the current study, I have used 16 topographic attributes. These were calculated using the digital elevation model of 200, which was at 250-meter resolution. And we used two climatic variables: surface atmospheric temperature and precipitation. And we have used 18 land cover types and 13 bedrock geology data with 2,700 samples. And we used an approach, it's called regression GRIG approach. And this approach basically combines both environmental correlation between soil organic carbon and environmental factors and spatial autocorrelation between the SOC observations. And we implemented or applied this approach at 3 different land mass in the Russian and European part of the circumpolar region, Northern American and Greenland part of the circumpolar region, and Tibetan permafrost region. And we also applied it at 3 depth intervals: 0 to 1 meter, 1 to 2 meter, and 2 to 3 meter depth intervals. And after applying this approach, we quantified the residuals at each sampling sites, and we used this residual to conduct the uncertainty analysis. And by calculating the variance among the model residuals, we calculated the upper and lower prediction intervals using this approach. Now in this slide, I'm showing what were the statistically significant predictors in northern circumpolar permafrost region. So among the 16 topographic attributes we used, there were 5 topographic attributes which were significant predictors of carbon stocks. And among climatic variable, average annual temperature was a predictor, significant predictor of northern circumpolar region, and land cover type and bedrock geology types were the significant predictors. In Tibetan region, among 16 topographic attributes, only 2 were significant predictors. They were elevation and soil wetness index, and precipitation was a strong climatic predictor, and land cover types were also significant predictors, but bedrock geology was not a significant predictor in Tibetan permafrost region. Now coming to the results. Our approach showed that northern circumpolar region contains about 1,000 petagram of carbon. And here the positive and negative sign shows the upper and lower prediction intervals. And out of this 1,000 petagram, about 51% is stored in 0 to 1 meter, about 31% is stored in 1 to 2 meter depth interval, and about 17% is stored in 2 to 3 meter depth interval. And the upper figure is showing the spatial distribution of carbon stocks in the northern circumpolar region, and the bottom figure is showing the percent uncertainty. And we thought that it would be powerful to represent the uncertainty, the upper and lower bound of prediction intervals in terms of percent. It will allow us to show clearly which areas have higher uncertainty and which area will have a lower uncertainty. So if you compare these figures, you will see that there is an inverse relation between the carbon stock amount and the uncertainty. So in the areas where you have higher carbon stock have lower uncertainty, and the area where you have lower carbon concentration has higher uncertainty. And this prediction uncertainty also increased with soil depth, and our total associated estimate for this total 0 to 3 meter is more or less similar to earlier estimates. And we are reporting 3 and 2% lower estimates than Tarnokai's and Gustav Hugelier's estimates. And our estimates showed a different spatial and vertical distribution. Though the total magnitude is same, we are representing about 38 petagram more carbon in 0 to 1 meter depth interval. And our approach captures 78% of the heterogeneity that existed in soil organic carbon field observations in the northern circumpolar region. In the Tibetan permafrost region, our estimate is about 14 petagram of carbon, which is 1 petagram less than the Ding et al. Study that was published by our co-author Yuan He's team. And I think they were the first to document the permafrost carbon storage in Tibetan region. And we are reporting about 64% of this estimate in 0 to 1 meter and 18% of carbon in 1 to 2 meter and 2 to 3 meter depth interval. And our estimate is 1 petagram less than Yuan He's group's estimate. And the reason is probably we have used a newer permafrost map, permafrost distribution map. So our map masks out only the areas where the permafrost is present. And we report greater amount of carbon stock in surface soils in comparison to deeper soils. And what we also found that during our validation that prediction error doubled in deeper depth intervals in comparison to surface soils. And similar was the case with northern circumpolar region, where prediction error doubled in 1 to 2 meter and it becomes 3 times in 2 to 3 meter depth interval. And our approach captures 64% of the heterogeneity that exists in carbon field observations in Tibetan permafrost region. Now, we don't usually quantify the role of environmental controllers separately, but one of our reviewers suggested that it might be really meaningful if you partition that and report what are the amount of variation that environmental controllers are predicting in permafrost regions. So we conducted this additional analysis during our review process. And what we found that number of environmental predictors decreased with depth in both permafrost regions. And environmental factors alone, without considering the spatial autocorrelation, were predicting about 5% to 57% of variation in carbon stocks of permafrost region, depending on the region and the depth interval. And we found that precipitation alone explained 47 and 24% of the variation in carbon stocks at surface soil, 0 to 30 centimeter. Again, this analysis was added on the request of reviewers. They also want to see the distribution of carbon stocks in 0 to 30 centimeters. And temperature alone explained 2 to 15% of the variation in carbon stocks of the circumpolar region. And we found that elevation and soil wetness index were consistently significant predictors of carbon stocks in both permafrost regions. And the slope angle alone explained 23% of the variation in carbon stocks of 1 to 2 meter depth interval in northern circumpolar region. Now I would like to show you how the soil organic carbon stocks were distributed across different topographic positions in both permafrost regions. So for this analysis, we categorized the whole land area into 4 different categories: the convex landscape, concave landscape, flat area, which has less than 2% of slope, and a linear landscape to represent the mid-slope positions. And we found that the magnitude of carbon stocks in different topographic positions were not consistent across both permafrost regions. So you will see, for example, in the flat areas of circumpolar region had total carbon stocks, but this flat area has lesser amount of carbon stock in Tibetan permafrost region. And we found a toe slope and hilltop positions of circumpolar region having highest uncertainty in predicted carbon stocks. Similarly, the flat areas of Tibetan permafrost region had the largest uncertainty in Tibetan region. Now, in this slide, I'm trying to show the climatic controls that we observed across the permafrost carbon distribution in both permafrost regions, and our results suggest nonlinear controls of climatic factors and carbon stocks on both circumpolar and Tibetan permafrost regions. And we also found that temperature was a significant controller of circumpolar region permafrost carbon, whereas precipitation was a significant predictor in Tibetan permafrost region carbon. Here, temperature was not a significant predictor. And we found that average carbon stocks decreased as precipitation increased in the circumpolar permafrost region. And the average carbon stocks in Tibetan region increased exponentially with increase in precipitation. And our predictions of a lower amount of carbon stocks in the areas of circumpolar high Arctic region, which has the lowest temperature and precipitation, it's consistent with the findings of Gustav Hugelius and colleagues, who also reported that the polar desert, because they have very thin soils, have a very less amount of carbon stocks. Now, on the distribution of carbon stock across different land cover types, we found that average carbon stock was highest in shrub wetlands and lowest in closed evergreen forest in circumpolar region. And similarly, the average carbon stock was highest in the mixed forest, and it was lowest in the grasslands of Tibetan permafrost region. The tundra vegetation of circumpolar region had highest total carbon stocks, and grasslands of Tibetan permafrost region had highest total carbon stocks. Similarly, the needle-leafed evergreen vegetation stored lowest carbon stocks, and grasslands of Tibetan permafrost region had the lowest mosaic of a grassland and shrubland of Tibetan permafrost region showed a lowest carbon stocks. And regarding the uncertainty, we found needle leaf evergreen forest of circumpolar region having largest uncertainty, and the grasslands of Tibetan permafrost region having the largest uncertainty. Now, Christina very nicely suggested me to have a comparison between our study and the previous study. So I prepared this slide where I'm showing that how across different depth intervals, the number of samples or of field observations that we have used compares with Hugelius and colleagues' study. And this table shows that we are using about 42% higher samples in 0 to 1 meter depth intervals, about 70% more samples in 1 to 2 meter depth interval, and about 53% more samples in 2 to 3 meter depth interval in the northern circumpolar region. And our predictions are about 38 petagram, which is about 8% more in 0 to 1 meter depth interval. Similarly, in 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 meter depth interval, we are reporting lesser amount of carbon stocks. And we are reporting total of 1,000 petagram, whereas Hugelius et al. Reported 1,034 petagram in the northern circumpolar region. And with the Tibetan permafrost region, we have used the same amount of samples, and our estimates are also more or less same. So that's why in this comparison, I've only showed you the comparison in northern circumpolar region. Now, I would like to talk about the assumptions and limitations that I found in this study. Because we have used a large number of samples which come from a number of investigators, we assume that soil organic carbon content doesn't increase with depth. And we have used this assumption to gap fill certain soil horizon and depth intervals. Because once you receive the data, it won't be in the usable format, and you have to do many things or many more things to the data before you can use it. So we have used this assumption to the gap fill for the certain values which were not available. And through our efforts, we increased the sample density from more than 10,000 kilometers square per sample to currently at 7,500 kilometers square per sample. And I would say that these sampling points were not uniformly distributed across different soil forming factors that I earlier explained. And basically transportation routes largely determined sampling sites in the circumpolar permafrost region. And I believe our estimate is an underestimate of permafrost region carbon stocks, as our samples do not include observations from deeper soil layers below 3-meter depth. And there are spatially a high amount of carbon stored in peatlands, eudoma, deltaic deposits, and hill-toe soil deposits below 3-meter depth. So I think if you take into account of these carbon stocks, the total carbon storage should be dramatically higher. And we have used Pedo transfer functions to predict the bulk density, which is needed to convert the carbon concentration into carbon stocks by using the soil texture information from specific soil horizon and depth intervals. And obviously, we have used a variety of soil samples that came from a number of investigators, which has used a different kind of carbon measurement techniques. And I would like to summarize this talk by saying that our approach identified dominant environmental predictors. We predicted spatial heterogeneity of permafrost carbon stocks and quantified the uncertainty in carbon stocks across different geographic areas and for different depth intervals. And though total regional carbon amounts were similar to earlier studies, our approach showed a different spatial distribution and depth distribution of carbon storage across the permafrost region. And our spatially explicit carbon stock estimates can be used to benchmark the land surface representation of high latitude carbon stocks. And this can hopefully reduce the uncertainty in carbon climate feedback projections of the land surface models if they are tuned to represent the spatial distribution as we reported in this study. And I also believe that international collaborations like one which we have put together could increase availability of samples in future. And we especially need more samples from Russia, Canada, and Tibet region. And this could reduce the existing uncertainty that we have in permafrost carbon stock estimates today. And my effort during this study were supported by 2 programs of US Department of Energy. And this study has been helped by different members of Permafrost Carbon Network who have provided valuable data sets and suggestions. And the work that I represented is not only my work, we are 20 other authors who have significantly contributed to this study. And we are also running a soil organic carbon working group under our project funded by regional and global model analysis. So if you are in the audience who are interested to improve the benchmarking of land surface model representations of carbon, please join us. We would like to welcome you in our group. And with this, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. And I would love to have questions or engage into discussions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Umakant. This is really interesting. I would like to open it up for participants to ask questions. You can either do this by just asking a question, or if you would rather type it into the chat box, that's totally fine as well.
Umakant, I would ask one about the comparison to Gustav's paper, which you said a little bit about, but I was curious about the spatial resolution of those two of your study and his, and also whether there were consistencies about the environmental controllers that were found, or whether they did that in the same way you did it?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, so I think Gustav's and Charles Tarnokai's study, both of these studies used soil order maps. So I would assume that it would be difficult to provide spatial resolution in that, because these are big polygons which can, I mean, encompass a very large region. But in case of our study, because of the environmental data sets we have used, we are able to produce the spatial resolution of 250 meters. And regarding your question of whether they use the same environmental factors, I think it would be rational to say that when soil order maps were created, they might have also used the importance of these different soil forming factors. But maybe I have done a better job in explicitly quantifying their contributions in a statistically manner.
And how important is it that you did it at 250 meters?
Yes, so this is a very important question. Like I take this question in a way that what spatial resolution is a good spatial resolution. So because I have spent a large part of my career in this area, I think the spatial resolution is ideal, which can represent the landscape features of where you are. So for example, in this study, we are talking about permafrost region carbon stocks. So you have to look at what are the landscape features you want to represent in your estimates. And on that basis, you have to define your spatial resolution. So if, for example, if somebody is talking about carbon stocks for storage in only cryoturbated soils, maybe he has to go to much finer resolution than what I did. But because my objective was to do this whole circumpolar region and combine also with Tibetan permafrost region, I chose to use the highest resolution digital elevation model that was available at that time. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.
But it's a research question. You cannot have one answer for this.
Actually, I have a question for you, Bill, in regard to this publication. Do you think you are going to include this different or new approach in your modeling estimates, or are you going to stick with what you already do? What's the recommended pathway here?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. These studies point out very large conflicts with how the models work. For example, the topographical issues Umakant was mentioning, right? Not represented in current models. Podsolization, what is that? You know, the models don't consider that transport and stabilization of carbon. There's a lot of things that show up in these observational analyses that are not even included. So to your question, you know, people are thinking about hill slope scale models that could account for some of this important features. In the Arctic, it's even harder though, because there's all the ice that we don't know where it all is, and as it thaws, it changes the topography. So there are also model efforts to do that, include that in things like CLM. There's, what's her name, Hannah Lee's work, and others. So I think it feels like we're at this cusp where we're bringing in real soil scientists to these models, and the process, and what we're learning is that we don't have those representations in the models yet. And we know we need to. So
they need to get included is your final.
So otherwise, you know, the other option is to do things like machine learning. You know, use these data sets, build machine learning models of the controllers' effects on the carbon, and integrate those. And people are doing that. And then the third option is to integrate machine learning with the prognostic mechanistic, quote unquote, mechanistic models. And so people are developing those methods too. And I have a feeling that in the end, we're going to end up with that kind of a hybrid scheme.
for now, at least.
Yeah.
Thank you. There was one question in the chat box by Bharat Sharma. If Umakant, you can please explain some details of the methods. Bharat, would you mind maybe saying exactly what you're looking for? What kind of?
So
Yeah.
is this the figure? Hi,
Yeah.
Bharat. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to know a bit more about this regression grigging approach.
Sure. Yeah. So, Bharat, if you look at the soil science literature, there are a number of approaches that people are using, and it depends on what objectives they are trying to address, basically, and what kind of data set they have, and what kind of environmental factors data they have. So among all these approaches, this regression grigging approach is very popular among soil scientists because it has a theoretical background, because it, as I said, it uses both the correlation between environmental factors and soil carbon stocks, and also the spatial autocorrelation part. Like I have used the spatial autocorrelation techniques or geostatistics in many of my studies. And the fundamental principle of that geostatistics is that if you have, let's say you have one sample at a certain XY location, the other sample, the more closer it is to the existing sample, it is more likely to have similar properties. And the more farther the other sample is, the more likely it will have dissimilar soil properties. So we model that by using variograms, and then we combined that in our environmental correlation framework and develop a hybrid prediction approach, and this is called regression grigging approach. And this has been widely used in soil science literature, and this is said to produce highest prediction accuracy. In a separate study, I also looked at how this approach does in comparison to newly coming up machine learning approaches. And what we found that this is as good as a random forest, but if you take an ensemble of different machine learning approaches, we looked at 4 or 5 of them, then the machine learning produces slightly better predictions than regression grigging. So if you want to learn more about this, I know we are in touch with our Rubisco project. We can discuss about in depth about this, and I would like to help you if you want to use this approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There's one more question in the chat box, and then maybe we can open it back up to the audience. Sasha Peterson is asking, do you think there is a significant importance in the soil-organic carbon differences between smaller scalar geomorphology, such as young versus old drained lake basins?
Yes, for sure. Obviously, when soil drainage is an important predictor, it showed up in our analysis as well, where we try to represent the soil wetness or drainage condition as a soil wetness index. So I think we don't have that kind of specific information for a larger area. For example, if we have that information of history of soil drainage condition for whole circumpolar region, I would love to include that in my analysis, or anybody will be interested to do that.
Thank you. Other questions in the audience?
I just typed one in, Umakant. I was just curious, you mentioned at the end with your assessment of where biases might be because where the sampling spots are, they're along the roads.
Yes.
How do we quantify the effect of that type of bias, like that kind of selection bias? Or can we?
Great question. I had the same.
Okay.
Yes. So, Bill, rather than analyzing a bias due to this, which can be done like by dropping those samples in analysis and again including them, you could do some analysis like this. But I think what is probably more important will be a kind of study that we did for Alaska, in 2000, I think it was in 2017, we published a paper. The question we asked was where you need to take your samples if you want to reduce the existing uncertainty in permafrost carbon stocks to 95% confidence interval. So you can do that math and calculate how many samples do you need to reduce the uncertainty. And then you can distribute those samples in the by using some approach like Latin hypercube sampling, by taking the combination of different soil forming factors. And now when you have that kind of sampling design, then you can take the existing samples where they are located, let's say, for example, along the road networks. And then you can calculate the spatial autocorrelation length from the existing samples. And then you can buffer out the samples that is in spatial autocorrelation length of the existing samples. And then maybe you can focus the new sampling sets which represent the combination of these soil forming factors. I think that would be more effective way to reduce the uncertainty by taking new samples. That would be my answer, Bill.
Thank you. We have time for more questions.
Also, I would like to have a question to audience, like how they feel the importance of these regional studies and what could be further directions. Like one thing that I'm thinking is currently we might, as I said, the prediction errors, they increase rapidly as we go deeper into the depth. For example, in the northern circumpolar region, in comparison to 0 to 1 meter depth interval, the prediction error doubled in 1 to 2 meter, and it tripled in 2 to 3 meter. In the Tibetan region, the prediction error doubled in deeper depth intervals. So I think our focus should be to how we can reduce that uncertainty in deeper depths, because we know permafrost domain store large amount of carbon at deeper depth intervals. So any thoughts, any remarks regarding this, that would be very appreciated.
Feel free to type your answer into the chat box if you don't want to speak up.
Umakant, it would be really interesting, you were mentioning your 2017 paper, to give us a sense of the cost of improving the accuracy. So how, just, I don't know how to do this, but how much does it cost to send somebody out to make a measurement at 0 to 1 meters versus 2 to 3 meters in different places, and overlay that cost on the value of measurements outside the correlation length of where you already have them? I think it'd be an interesting exercise. Or even just, if you don't want to do the cost, like, can you make a map of where you, in order to get a reduction of error of X%, you need this map of samples.
Oh,
7
okay.
here, 2 here, 6 there.
I see. Okay. Yeah, this is a very, very brilliant suggestion, Bill. I sincerely appreciate it. So you are saying, rather than suggesting that the total magnitude of uncertainty decrease, why don't we look at the incremental decrease in uncertainty?
Right.
And then try to identify which locations are those. Yes, that can be done, but I have not done it yet.
Oh, no, it's, yeah.
Yeah. But this is a very, very nice suggestion, yeah.
The other thing I was wondering about is, you're telling us about the stocks, which is super important. Can you tell us something about the vulnerability of those stocks? Well,
yes, we are doing this study, but that's in the continental US.
Okay.
So we are looking at ensemble machine learning approaches and try to predict the vulnerability of carbon stocks. And because we can do it at a much finer resolution than land surface models, I think this is much more much more finer, high resolution estimates which you can relate to landscape features and land cover types.
And are you doing that with some sort of temperature and moisture sensitivity?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Good.
But I have not done it for the circumpolar permafrost region. Yes, but I am interested to look at those kind of questions. Yeah, like where you fit, vertical distribution of carbon stock, and then try to see how the machine learning approaches, the ensemble machine learning approaches might suggest where are the regions where you will get larger carbon release versus lesser carbon release. Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's a combination of things we want to know. Carbon stocks is one really useful component, but then we want to know,
The
is
vulnerability.
it safe or is it not? Yeah. So we have like 10 minutes left, and maybe I wanted to shift it to member updates, unless there are other questions, which is fine. You can just do this in between. Would anyone like to make an announcement about another new publication or an upcoming meeting that's of interest to this group? Please share. Well, maybe I can go first. The Permafrost Collaboration Team, together with the national academies, is planning another workshop or another meeting next month on the April 13th, where we'll discuss the possible next steps for improving permafrost carbon modeling in Earth system models and process-based models. And there will be an email, of course, with an invitation for members to join. But I think given the topic today, this could be of interest for many of you. They're very quiet today.
I'll add a quick update from IARPIC. I'm going to put in the chat a link to where everyone can find the newly released for public comment draft IARPIC research plan. And that draft will be open for comment until June 11th. So we recommend reading and would encourage comments from anyone on what the plan has included, has not included, ideas on implementation, ideas on partners. The plan does look quite different than the current plan, so I'm sure that the team leaders for this team will be having discussions and maybe gathering comments about how the Permafrost team fits into this draft new plan and structure.
Yes, actually, we do appreciate feedback. The three team leads, we would like to hear from the community what would be important to be included, for sure. Did someone want to say something? I can't see. Otherwise, I mean, I think we would be okay closing out this meeting a little earlier. Thank you, Umakant, again for your presentation. I thought this was really useful and hopefully also in particular useful for people that are working with carbon stock modeling. And we hope to see you next month in our next team meeting. And
Christina, I think that Miriam had a comment and a question. Miriam, if you want to speak to that.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if she already left, actually. So her comment was, it seems like it would be important to know how vulnerable carbon at deeper depths are to loss to know where to focus sampling efforts, perhaps linked to ground ice content.
Yeah, I'm here, Christina.
Oh, you're still like, I don't see you, sorry.
Yeah, I just was thinking about, we may not lose carbon everywhere at depth. And so it would be important to know which places are the most vulnerable. And perhaps that's linked to high ground ice areas that are more likely to expose much deeper soil to thaw in an abrupt sense.
Yeah, I really like medium suggestion, because normally the vulnerability analysis which are done currently, they use the climatic variables to suggest which areas are more vulnerable or less. But I guess for permafrost domain, sea ice plays also equally important role. And incorporating this data with climate data might provide a more robust estimate of vulnerable areas versus less vulnerable areas.
Miriam, I think you were talking about land, like ground ice.
Ground
Is that
ice.
right? Yeah, ground
I'm
ice.
thinking ground ice. I mean, I know sea ice is also important to permafrost thaw, but slightly different process, I guess.
You know, one thing, Umakant, that occurs to me, there's always this concern that we're going to decompose more soil organic matter, and therefore it's a positive feedback to climate change. But at the same time, you're doing decomposition, you're releasing nitrogen. And in these systems, that causes more photosynthesis and input to the soil. So did you, or are there data sets available that, you know, if you do a vulnerability analysis and a sensitivity to temperature and precip changes, et cetera, on nutrient composition as well, and link that to nutrient availability? Is that possible with the measurements that are available, which you synthesized here?
So, like I do have nitrogen measurements across Alaska, but I do not have it across the northern circumpolar region. So to answer your question, maybe that kind of analysis can be implemented in Alaska, but
I think it'd be valuable to do so. You know, there's a real distinction now between what the models are predicting and what the observationalists are inferring and extrapolating with various machine learning approaches. And I think it seems to come down to this issue of the short-term releases associated with temperature from decomposition versus the slightly longer, decadal changes in vegetation growth, and maybe transition to shrubs, which will have higher C to N. They won't be as the litter won't be as decomposable, et cetera. That will add carbon.
yes, for sure.
Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Umakant, for your presentation. And I think I'm going to close this meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Umakant.